Chapter 10 of The Second Son, Volumes 1 and 2. This is Volume 1, Chapter 10. Remilia's body was surrendered to the sea, adorned with a white cotton sheet, and weighted down with 2 cannonballs fastened to his ankles. As he was placed gently into the water, a mere moment would pass before the abyss levied its darkness on his bright veil as he descended. The Ravensword swayed with poise amidst the serene waves, seemingly partial to the ceremony as Captain Valara observed his ill-fated and brief devotion. Death has freed you from your service to Odin, for which you served honorably. Let the sea take you, as you are safe amongst the wisdom of your ancestors, and the tyranny of the world above no longer has dominion over your soul. The crew was noiseless as they bore witness to the somber affair. Even the children embraced the quiet, but their silence was scorned by the distant pleas of the surviving crew still treading water near the sinking ship that chose to attack them. The Odinites would not heed their cries, and the captain ordered their departure from the battlefield minutes later. Rocco directed several crew members to patch the hole made by the cannon with the children commanded to watch, so they could be familiarized with the task. Harker and Sinmo wept in one another's company as they mopped Remilia's blood from the deck. When their obligations were fulfilled, they summoned the children, and they obliged them under the misapprehension they would return to their lessons. Sinmo's voice was solemn, for he was inclined to impart to his wards their loss would obliterate all evidence of his mirth or indifference. We will rest for today and tomorrow. There will be no lessons. If any of you would choose to confide in us, we are available, he said, pointing at his colleague, who nodded in kind. Syrian yelled, destroying the silence and startling all those present. Sol patted him on the shoulder, knowing her touch was a welcome diversion from his obsessive rumination. She spoke up. Could you tell us a story, Maester Harker? You would like to hear one? He asked, suspecting her request was induced by perceiving the turmoil and confusion in the other children at Remilia's death. The children nodded, but revealed no eagerness as he paused, contemplating which tale was most appropriate. I haven't told you about the learned Elby stonemason, have I? When they declined knowing of whom he spoke, he began with gestures dampened by his sorrow. Her tale is a fascinating one. Born into a family of stonemasons, her parents were keen on her inheriting their business when she became of age. However, she was disposed to study the curious properties of plants. She hailed from an area of the world called Driat, now which wants for water in large parts of the country. The wells to locate this vital resource were dug more than 50 meters deep. The nation suffered a reputation for importing most of its goods, and were thus financially exploited by those foreign and local merchants devoid of sympathy for these troubles. But it was a land rich in rare minerals in its desert mountains. Elby's pursuit of mastery over agriculture confounded her parents, who were incensed their business might be abandoned by their only progeny. At an age no older than Sol, and without the aid of a formal education, she began her experiments near the border of the bountiful nation of Griamon, where she was relocated after being wed to a man named Retrodun in an arranged marriage. She wrote in her journals that her earliest contention was informed by evidence that the clouds and climate in the shadow of the mountains at the border were conducive to her aims of growing crops resilient to abundant sunlight. Using the dowry issued by her parents, she purchased seeds of a vegetable called corn. It may seem strange to you all, but corn was not always as prevalent as it is now. It was popularized by her. Her first trial was a failure, but she was not discouraged. She studied the soil and hypothesized it must have lacked the nutrients necessary to nourish her crops. Over 2 years, she planted seeds she gathered across the border, traversing the mountainous landscape more than a dozen times in 3 months to gather a sufficient supply. Retrodun was intrigued as she labored to produce what many considered undesirable weeds. He joined her mission, and after 2 years of these efforts, she stirred the darkened soil and planted the corn again. Her discoveries revolutionized practices around the world when her yields surpassed all others combined in her country with similar aims that were once thought to be the most promising locations for such application. But a claim was not rendered unto her initially. Upon revealing her experiments to her sovereign King Judamon, he had her arrested for witchcraft and sentenced to death by starvation. Her husband, however, was spared, and rather than reluctantly adopting the prevailing view, she employed dark magic. He traveled across the barren nation and taught others her methods. He was awarded the credit for her achievements by historians for more than 200 years, until Driot fell into rebellion, and the lineage of King Judamon was severed, and the truth of her selfless pursuits were spread by the new monarch, King Ridderoth. Ubby Stonemason was named the mother of Driot, which is the highest honor the queen felt she could bestow on the remarkable and once forgotten woman. Why did the king think she was a witch? Vodstock asked with genuine confusion. Did she have warts? No, Harker began, trying to discern how warts was relevant. It was simply a convenient lie to disguise his greed. He enjoyed the taxes generated from the sale of the expensive produce, and lacked the foresight to realize what she had accomplished. Most monarchs share this deficiency of wisdom, but that is by design. It is rare in history to find sustained benevolence because those subjects closest to any crown are often the wealthiest and otherwise most powerful, and they are inclined to not suffer their gains to be taxed and employed to improve the lives of the poor. There are countless instances in the past of successfully deadly collaboration between these beneficiaries of such a system. So if a child, king, or queen displayed an especially charitable and compassionate disposition, they were likely to never reach adulthood. Firo descended the steps to their compartment noisily and announced with feigned gaiety, "Anyone want to come with me and play with some swords?" Firo delighted in popping Sol and Syrian on the head with the hilt of his short sword as they trudged by, and he chuckled as they grasped the fresh lunk, exclaiming, "Ow!" Dara remained behind, seated with her legs crossed while attending to a book. The others vanished with Harker and Sinmo following the children to the deck grudgingly. Most of them had developed the strength to hold the wooden swords upright and train with them. Sol exchanged strikes with Syrian. Moon and Sky predictably did not tolerate sparring with anyone other than each other, and they preferred the use of daggers. Vodstock wandered about alone, his eyes becoming damp with tears, as he would often practice with Romelia, and no one of his like society offered to exchange blows with him, and his utter loneliness in that moment devoured his imperishable spirit. Firo identified his misery, and thought to spare the boy the neglect of his peers by approaching and commanding him with paternal affection. "Come here, boy, I'll spar with you." Vodstock dried his tears with his half-mask before drawing the improvised weapon. When his arms were outstretched and he held the wooden sword, Firo kicked it at his feet to adjust his stance and said, "All right, let's go. Come at me." The boy efforted to impress his instructor, but his attempts to strike him were so deprived of grace, Firo did not know where to begin in improving him. The former knight slapped Vodstock's sword away as it sluggishly swept the air before his face, and the boy scrambled to retrieve it as tumbled upon the deck. He was humiliated by Firo's tactics to the extent that it would enrage him, until he abandoned all form to swing wildly. His instructor shook his head before smiling at him to dispel his inconsiderable wrath, but the boy would suffer his shame no more, and his tantrum precipitated in him inadvertently striking Sky in the arm, who booted him to the floor for his offense. The former knight kneeled beside Vodstock as he sat up. His lip quivered as the pain in his chest subsided, but his memory of the event would never diminish in quality or effect for the rest of his life. Firo patted him where her foot struck, and he said, "Fighting's about control. Ain't nothing worse than hurting your own side, believe my words." The boy's common was practiced enough to understand the essence of his preachments, and so he nodded before rising from the deck, sniffling and expending the rest of his fortitude to restrain his tears. Firo went on as they moved apart. Try to keep the hilt of your sword near your center. You don't want it too far this way or that. You have to be able to defend yourself as well, and you can't have it when you've got it out here, you understand? Vodstock nodded again as he studied his movements, but he was nearly bankrupt of confidence in his own abilities. The most capable amongst the children, Firo estimated, were Moon and Sky. He judged they would be quite skilled by the time they arrived at the fleet. Sol was coming along well, too, but Syrian was merely average, which meant his sister would take much longer to improve if deprived a sparring partner of greater or equal measure. As he reflected on Ramelia's death, he somberly considered how they might perform in their first real battle. But Captain Valara's appearance embarrassed them, and they ceased their training as she addressed the former Wulu knight. How are they all coming along? They're doing quite well, Firo lied. But the truth was unnecessary, as his captain was keenly aware of their abilities without bearing direct witness to it. She examined the grace in their movements before Sol spoke up with impish intent. Is there anyone that can beat you, Firo? I haven't met them yet, he chuckled at her suggestion, but his earned arrogance would be awkwardly stayed when Vodstock followed up. What about the captain? I've never fought the captain, he muttered, attempting to defend his dignity without compromising his leaders. I've no reason to. But could you best her? Sol asked, but their inquiry, he was certain, was their cheeky pursuit of escaping their restless state and boredom. He studied his captain's countenance and pursed his lips before answering with the agreeableness of a sufficiently compensated diplomat. I don't know, and I don't want to find out. Captain, could you better Firo in a fight? Syrian advanced the challenge, but was wholly oblivious to the perilous circumstances in which Firo found himself. The former knight sheathed his sword in a show of submission, but Captain Valara shrugged, refraining from shameless self-endorsement, and rejoined, We refer to it as a duel, and perhaps he's grown since we last sparred. Let's find out. Firo sighed with exasperation that suffocated his paltry resolve, and knew that even if he were to fight while devoted to winning, she would still prevail, and so he surrendered unequivocally. Captain, I respect you too much, and you know better than most. She did not wait for him to finish, and instead returned to her quarters. A moment later, she threw the door open, gripping a plain sword in her left hand, and an ornate hatchet in the right. The entire crew dispensed with their discipline and cheered gleefully. Captain, Firo gestured again he would decline her challenge. Shut up and draw your sword, she ordered, spinning her weapons in her hand casually. The children were awestruck by her finesse as the former knight's blade appeared. The children had never witnessed such focus from Firo. Captain Valara approached him slowly, and offered several feints that necessitated all of his speed to avoid. As he blocked her sword, the axe emerged and nearly struck him in the face, but she would turn it in the final moment to strike him across the cheek. With a broad side, Firo reeled from the attack before attempting to roll beneath her second advance and end up behind her, but she anticipated this strategy and smacked him in the leg with the flat side of her sword. He yelped in pain and limped away, struggling to walk it off. She came at him again, still measured, each assault meant to displace him and melt his defenses. He attempted a feeble offensive, but she was already upon him and unleashing a flurry of attacks, until at last she maneuvered through his provisional barricade and tapped her axe gently against his throat, ending the contest. I yield, he announced with his hands up, and retreating from the refined edge. She smirked at the former knight and briefly entertained the fanfare hollowed by her crew before departing to her quarters with evident swagger. Sol giggled at his defeat, but she withdrew from her amusement when she recalled having only witnessed a contest so mismatched at her home in Khufu, when enslaved criminals were armed to battle the supremely trained royal guard in the arena for the recreation of gambling. The captain made you seem like one of us. Firo moved to resume his training with Vodstock when they heard Zango call from above, Ship on the horizon. Scene 2. Captain Valara charged from her room and ordered Rocco to initiate general quarters to prepare for battle. She peered through her telescope, but failed to discern from where the ship hailed. As they waited for the enemy to approach, the children were taken below deck, where they laid their bodies against the floor and placed their hands over their ears, with the terror of imminent death driving them to sobbing. Harker could not resist his own tears as he lay beside them, his heart pumping so powerfully he could perceive his chest rising and falling with the beat. Captain Villara employed her telescope once again until her arms dropped to her side and she smiled. "Stand down. It's another clan. Skilljung." "Stand down," Rocco repeated with relief. Harker's innards loosened as peace washed over him, and he flew to the toilet. Sinmo helped the children to their feet, and renewed in their courage, they stood and peered out to see the approaching ship. As the distance closed between them, the Skilljung craft turned and began sailing on the same heading. They regarded the curious vessel with amazement, studied the stern faces of their compatriots, and celebrated their apparent ferocity. Their beards were braided the length of their torso, and they were armored in black leather with small metal plates providing flexibility to the material. The kids required several moments to realize the crew consisted mainly of adults. The hardened sailors appeared in full on their deck, and remained motionless as they returned their stare while the pair sailed northeast. "Are they going to the fleet as well?" Harker posed the question to Zengo while his unease rose again. "Yes, they are." She ballooned with pride at the sight of her comrades. "Nearly every ship has been summoned." Sinmo mentioned the captain making a report for Admiral Bregor. The teacher recalled while observing their wavering flag bearing the symbol of a species of tree unknown to him. She'll do that," Zengo began laconically before chuckling at the absurdity of the captain obliging a handful of old politicians in tactics of war. "Then she'll decide where we sail to next." "Which regiment is this?" Harker asked, and his ignorance of the proper nomenclature elicited a chuckle from his new friend. "Clan Skilljung. They're untamed, but a still conquered peoples." She turned away and ascended the steps to the rear of the ship and gazed out. As Harker trailed behind her, he enumerated his knowledge on their history. Those students of politics and world affairs wagered they would abandon Odin once the Polmarks stole your land. I'm pleasantly surprised by this development. "We may be at war with them once we return. I'd caution you against endearing yourself to them any more intimately than where you stand now." Zengo's voice fell as she considered their tenuous alliance. "Why? Surely the war against your occupiers would yield some lasting cooperation between your peoples. How can it be that no goodwill has been fostered between you?" Harker was confounded by her admonitions. "They would once commit the moral crime of cannibalism. You're aware of this, I'm sure. The reputation for it is not the product of any fiction. If they descend into those dark traditions once again, Admiral Bregor will recommend an invasion. He prohibits the practice now, but what they do under the eyes of heaven and in the company of no other, they cannot be held to account. That they would even elect to accompany us so far from the vigilant watch of the Congress is curious indeed." Zengo uttered with genuine confusion, affecting to impart by her words that Odinite was, indeed, not a fixed attribute. "Have you ever spoken to one of them?" he asked. Realizing as he looked upon their faces, he could not make out the words carved into the port side of their ship. "No, they don't speak common, generally. However, the captain knows their language, as she lived among them in her youth. They likely wouldn't talk to you if they could manage it. She's explained to us many of them believe they have grown weak mixing with foreigners or even other clans. They are hard on their young, with many trials that can claim their lives quite easily. Those that survive, though, are smart, tough, and well-trained for battle." Harker was appalled that children would be so readily discarded for failing a trial dictated by tradition. His face turned sour as he uttered his criticism. "There's nothing noble about such a thing. Every person can contribute something, even if it isn't under the auspices of war." "Oh, yes, offer them your insight, then. Perhaps show them one of your books of poetry." "Fucking idiot. Do you not understand that they have no need for such things when they scratch their living off the mountain stone? They have nearly perished in total a dozen times over. For this they are few in number, but still deadly. The captain survived their trials. Do not let her hear your remarks. To contend that poetry has no place in society is the posture of ignorance." Harker began boldly. His convictions were offended, and he would not suffer his inaction to spare himself a bit of pain or discomfort inflicted by his comrade. He proceeded with his voice sharply reprimanding Zango in the spirit and manner of his profession. We are occasionally creatures of logic. Words are an extension of this. They communicate our most ardent beliefs, and they give voice to the otherwise voiceless. Without the art of writing, we might as well surrender all of our higher thinking with it, our history, our sciences. Look upon their ship. These barbarians bothered inscribing words just there. He pointed at the carvings with ire staining his inflection. What does Skoljang mean? Surely it is not random arrangement of letters. When translated, it would likely describe the essence of who they are. Would you deny that is not the purpose of poetry? His breath quickened as he awaited her response when she sighed and folded her arms across her chest before nodding. All right, you pogger, you've convinced me. What in heaven's name is a pogger? He asked, certain it was a word Odinites employed as an insult. Zango smirked and rejoined, It's someone who spends all day reading books and considering the sort of shite you do out loud to anyone who will listen. You always talk like that? Harker departed from her insincere inquiry and changed the subject abruptly. How many ships are in our fleet? Our fleet? Are you considering taking the oath? Zango retorted with disbelief before she went on without awaiting his answer. Understand me when I say poggers like you are a necessary component to a functioning government. You enjoy the task of listening to idiots drone on, and that's exactly what you'll find in Odin's Congress. Were it not for Admiral Bragor and the captain, I'm certain we'd have been wiped out by now because of their indecision. And your voice reminds me of my mother's. Calm, earnest, and convincing. She was a member of Odin's Congress before she was killed in the invasion. I'm humbled by your words, and I'm sorry for your loss. Harker replied astonished, and with genuine affection for her compliments, as it was apparent by her utterances that her mother's labors invoked in her great pride. The teacher continued with a question that remained unsatisfied with a qualified response. How is it Odin's military has not reclaimed their lost land with a fleet at their disposal? We have all fled to the sea, she began, and so the Polemarks have fortified the coast so that any invasion from whence we retreated would be catastrophic for us. We've made countless appeals in secret to neighboring countries to march through their lands, but were denied due to their fear of being invaded as a consequence for aiding us. I hold no ill will towards them, as I'm not alone in having loved ones currently hiding amongst the still free populations there. They must pay a tithing, but they are not forced to endure the relentless presence of the Concordafont, a name that collectively describes the Polemarks as occupying ground troops. If we're not certain that we can break through their defenses on the sea, then we will not attack until then. We fear for retribution against our citizens, vulnerable as they are. That is what the Admiral has long since decided. How many soldiers do you suppose will satisfy this necessity for security and victory? Harker posed the question, hopeless she would have the answers he sought. She shook her head reluctantly, denying intimate knowledge on the matter. We've added quite a few ourselves over the years, rescuing them from slavers and pirates and cities that would rather they starve. But desperation in a warrior it does not make. There is conflict in my heart about what the fleet may offer such wayward souls that bear our likeness in their aims, which is to say the desire for safety for themselves and their children, or plainly, liberty. 'Tis not the finest life, but it's still a chance at the fortunes of freedom. When I was but a girl, I learned during the invasion most were not even afforded the choice. They just died with a boot on their neck. Harker turned to the sea and peered out the constant motion of the water and the rushing sound as it passed on either side of the ship. He could hear the sails flapping as they caught wind again. Upon consideration of her solemn words, he recalled all those events in history where evil triumphed over good, and the innocent were slaughtered, with the gods denying those victims the power of their curses for which they tearfully beseeched in their final moments against their perpetrators, and those rulers refusing any respect for human life other than those they deemed worthy of it, and the often long and unbroken rule they administer with boundless cruelty, shaping the nature and habits of future kings. He rejected meek surrender in that moment, and decided he would choose a death elevated by honor and valor. I don't intend to die that way. So, after you fulfilled your obligations to the children, will you remain with us? I don't know for certain, he rejoined as Siri and shouted a curse from below deck, causing them both to look at the stairwell leading there, and he went on hesitantly. I'm no warrior, and to spill blood seems contrary to my nature. I know it is necessary, but poggers such as myself rely heavily on the deadly convictions of people like you to persist. As the last left his lips, he grinned at her. She smiled knowingly and descended to sentimental utterances. I'll endorse your submission to join us. I trust you possess the qualities to deem you an Odinite. What does that imply, your endorsement? Do I need it? Harker inquired, intrigued by her assurances. Zango's eyes drew to a close, and she replied with seriousness, Adults must be endorsed by an Odinite to be permitted to join, so that if you fail to uphold your oath, I'd be put to death along with you. My gods, I must confess I was not aware of this regulation. I've often wondered how your military was spared the spies that might have otherwise easily infiltrated your open ranks. He paused as if to say more, but Zango denied him the opportunity to continue. Sinma would have done it if I didn't. She brushed her short red hair with her fingers and said, And in my years knowing him, he rarely endorses anyone. He's something of a misanthrope. She was amused at her comrade's skepticism towards other adults, and his departure from those principles when it involved children. How long have you served Captain Villara? I've served with Captain for, nearly 40 years now. She was given command of her first ship, the Iron Trident. That was our smallest vessel, but we overcame many enemies much larger than our little skiff with our speed. I'd known her since we was children, too. It is indeed rare for an amateur historian such as Harker to discover a witness to the childhood of the celebrities of politics. His eyes widened as he asked fervently, What was she like? You must tell me. It might not surprise you to learn she's changed very little. We often trailed behind her, and she'd abuse us by running faster and longer until we could go no further. We would eventually find her awaiting her father's return from a long voyage on a snowy cliffside overlooking the Hell Sea. She was hardly 15 when she killed a woman intent on killing her for her station in life, and I can hardly believe it still. It was over a man. A man? Harker shouted, bewildered by the history she elucidated so casually. Zango promptly slapped the teacher and seethed as she scowled. Shush, I don't want her to hear. Harker gently massaged his cheek with contrition and whispered, I'm sorry, I simply can't. Just as you said, I cannot believe it. A man. He must be the most remarkable man in the world to have her affections. You might meet him one day. Zango's lips drew into skepticism at her own words. He lives still. Why are they not wedded? Zango was offended by his compulsion to apply his personally held cultural presumptions. You would have to ask her. But I'd caution you against doing so, as she seems to me indifferent to the failure of their matrimony. She's devoted to us and the restoration of her country. Poor woman ain't got the time for nothing else. Sinmo approached them slowly and interjected. The children are eating dinner, except for Dara, who is still reading. Can you get her to come down? Of course. And he departed Zango's company with a wave, and started towards Dara sitting upon a stairwell attempting to read by twilight. You will strain your eyes trying to read that. I cannot be certain, but there is evidence your eyes will diminish in their ability to perceive things clearly at a distance. Perhaps you should read by candlelight? I ran out of candles, she answered laconically, and without looking up at him. Well, it just so happens that I have quite a few candles hidden away for my personal use you can use. He began cheerfully, believing his words would please her. I found those, Dara informed him plainly, again never diverting her eyes from the page. Harker was astonished by her theft, and he confirmed he had heard her correctly. You used all my candles. Yes, she answered, looking up at him before returning her attention to the page. Could you... Good heavens, stay here. Harker implored her before going below deck to find Sinmo performing a puppet show. As he cautiously approached the old man and their entertainment was stilled, the children booed their young instructor. Sinmo stood up from behind the barrels where he kneeled, and, confounded by his interruption, he asked hastily, "What? What couldn't wait? Dara stole all my candles and used them. We don't have any left. How are we meant to—" "Oh," and he sighed, affecting he was ambivalent about her crime, given she was the only student that made any effort to read regularly. "I see," he continued while grabbing his chin pensively. "All right, I'll talk to her, since it was your belongings and you seem ill at ease. She's quite vulnerable, I think, to any form of discipline, given those recent sins so brutally brought to bear against her." "Thank you," Harker answered with relief before realizing Sinmo was offering the queen puppet and her loyal subject to him. The show must go on. Scene 3. Sinmo scrambled up the steps as his partner called to him. "Wait, what is the story?" But his words were not heeded, and as he kneeled behind the barrels, he discovered he would still be required to crouch to be hidden from view. He spoke hesitantly, addressing his audience with a feminine voice and adorning it with monarchic flair. "Might I be informed as to what we were discussing?" Several of the children embraced the opportunity to explain at once, and he pleaded with amusement, "Please, one person tell me." Vodstock stood up and spoke to the puppets delightedly. The alchemist was saying he was telling her he found a magic mushroom and she was going to eat it so she could fly. "That's the story?" he asked, bewildered by his colleague's imagination, and perhaps mistakenly instilling in them the deadly inclination to eat wild mushrooms. He raised his voice to be heard clearly by all present, and diverged from the tale to properly illuminate the danger of such inspiration. "I'll ask the alchemist to show me how he came to know this mushroom would grant me such powers." The children groaned as he began with the queen. "The stalk is hollow. What does that imply?" His other hand was animated in sync with his voice as he droned on about how nutrients passed through the stalk to the cap, and how this property was critical for temperature regulation and moisture control. The children sighed heavily as they began picking at the deck to make splinters in the wood with boredom, reducing their enthusiasm. Vodstock groaned loudly and fell onto his back. Harker lamented the failure to inform them of the perils he hoped to spare them before resigning to speaking with more theater and humor for the sake of amusement. "My loyal subject," he began with the queen, "where should we fly to first?" His departure from the unconsensual lesson recaptured their attention. "I don't know, my queen. You can go anywhere you desire." The queen paused in consideration before turning to the children and consulted their boundless imagination. "Where should I go?" They were collectively and coincidentally inspired to yell in unison, "Paradise!" He winced at the mention of Ciro and attempted to refuse. "I don't think we can go there because of the mists." The alchemist's voice descended as he went to suggest with little confidence in his scheme to direct them elsewhere. "Let's choose another place." "No, fly over it." Vodstock flapped his arms with a great grin, touching the far sides of his face. The alchemist dipped his head and thought. "How about we fly over the gilded wetlands in the western mainland of the Wooloo Empire and see the Gragolators and the Fist Monks? I bet you that wonderful and very smart Maester Harker has artist renderings of them to show you all." The kids cheered, mending their listlessness, and when Harker stood up, they applauded him again. He crossed the room, refreshed and inspired by their glee, and grabbed a copy of Animalia of the Palo, Gilded, and Mangala regions from the short bookshelf. As he flipped through the pages, the children would attempt to stop him and inquire with an enthusiasm most becoming, "What's that?" "Why don't you read it for us aloud?" Harker suggested to Syrian, admiring his words. The boy took the book and began to read shyly. The sea wolf is named thus as the word sea is an ancestor to the word sea. These wolves made the shores of the Silo Ocean and much of the land leading up to it their habitat, and has a diet consisting of mainly fish. They can even be found swimming in the shallow waters in packs. "Where can we look at one?" Sola interjected as she looked upon its gray fur and the hump between its shoulders. She was reminded of the troubles of Khufu when she learned from an old angler that, decades previously, the government expanded the land meant for residence of its nobles and their staff. A predator alike in nature and appearance to the sea wolf, sharing the land, became inclined to feast on the waste of the new humans living nearby, and thus growing acclimated to their presence, until at last they possessed no fear, and frequently waltzed into the villages to brutalize anyone that refused them food. The government offered a bounty for their pelts to cull their numbers, but the islands soon discovered their service to the sea and their society. The wolves were capable of consuming a fish rendered poisonous to humans, as a consequence of its diet of rotted seafoam kelp. And without their fiendish predator, the waters immediately surrounding the island became overwhelmed with the inedible fish. The sea kelp was consumed in full by the population, and thus the service of nutrients it also provided to the local coral meant the abundance of varietous neighbors of the sea fished and consumed regularly by the poorest and most famished of the island were pushed further and further away from the shore. Beggars' fishhooks remained sewn into the coast that now bore no life, and many families starved until their deaths. The nobles spared themselves the riots through promotion of the growing of grains for bread in the field not wholly conducive to the practice. However, their laborers were forced to expend an immense amount of fresh water to provide for the once barren land, until they discovered it was untenable to their supplies provided by the rain. When the Khufu government charged its Academy of Sciences to investigate, they estimated that they had mere months before their stores of fresh water collapsed completely. Absent the ignorance they imposed on their subjects, the nobles converted half their yields of fruit into wine to survive the drought, and further delivering themselves from the peril, manifesting in its streets, and in the most vulnerable members of their citizenry, the dry mouths of babes and the elderly. They provided sustenance for the guards and a handful of merchants, an obscene and surreptitious affair, and the feeble population of vassals were thus reduced to an inert state by their well-fed overlords, making revolution an absurd fantasy. And because fresh water had become more valuable than their own currency, the nobles used an inconsiderable sum of their remaining wealth to employ additional mercenaries from far-off places, who possessed no fondness for their impoverished neighbors, to protect them. After a time, the population fell into ruin, and the sustenance required for the commoners to persist achieved an equilibrium, and thus the maintenance of their rule was realized. Due to the absence of competition, the cost of trade services did briefly balloon throughout the island, but the government simply enslaved those skilled workers and forced them to educate the next generation that would replace them. The instructors were promised compensation in the form of land and a young, stout mule. But once their students were commissioned by the nobles following their completion of the training, they learned the accelerated education was insufficient for mastery of the work, and the nobles were left wanting for the same quality once produced by their slaves. Only 2 weeks following their retirement, and upon settling into their new homes, the teachers were stolen from their beds and their families by the private army in the dark of night, and enslaved again until their deaths some years later. Perhaps we will find the wolf dancing upon the shore. If you read further, it describes their mating rituals and how the males hopped atop the pillar trees with great speed to win the affections of the females of other packs. Harker explained in good humor as he went. Vodstock snatched the book from Syrian and exclaimed it was his turn. He adjusted his mask hastily and skillfully read. The hippoplatypus is the largest member of the genus Lattistacean Diramat. With an average weight of 4,000 pounds for males and 3,800 pounds for females, they would likely be formidable to any known predator in the world. They can run up to 35 miles an hour and can swim 45 miles per hour. While they cannot climb trees, their bills have strength enough to break through entire tree trunks and cause it to collapse for the purpose of damming parts of shallow rivers, to instead nourish their nests. They have been witnessed using their tails to kill their prey by striking them with it. The children gasped at the picture of the creature, about the size of a full-grown cow, but with large and round black eyes that were void of the humanity we are inclined to project onto beasts with bright and colorful eyes, not unlike ourselves. Its yellow bill was massive, while its body was covered in brown fur, except for the hands, which were hairless, and the tail was flat and long and wide, and almost leathery by appearance. Once he felt all the children were satisfied with the rendering, he flipped on and found the fist monks. They were creatures with pale coloring in the face and approximately the size of a full-grown chimpanzee, and bearing a rodent-like face, but more round in the cheeks. Its fur was shaded as if it were wearing a sort of red robe, and its hands were similar in function and appearance to human hands, but they could not straighten their fingers, so when they looked upon by early settlers, it gave them the impression they were fists. Predictably, the children, once deprived of knowledge in all its forms, were astonished by the book and the many animals foreign to them. When Sinmo returned later with Dara trailing behind him, Harker's incense was diffused by her show of contrition, and she spoke with earnest regret. "I'm sorry for stealing your candles, Maester Harker." As he kneeled to study her face, she locked her expression to exhibit the depths to which she would surrender her personal dignity to affirm and prayfully dispel the ire she invoked in him. Rather than suffer his abuse or further retribution for her crime, he touched the hair that lay upon her ear with tenderness and addressed her in a register that soothed her swelling apprehension. "I can see your despair for what you've done, but be still, for I'd not visit any wrath upon you such as the like you have come to know. This is not to say I'm not wounded by your dishonesty, but I'm, however, comforted by your remorse. If you believe in the gods, repent, and if you do not, then forgive yourself once you discover the glory of sharing with others your gains, even if they be ill-gotten. Thievery is often a crime of necessity. To steal food when your society dooms you to starvation is no crime at all. But to resort to banditry for those resources intended for the common good, such as the candles, you deprive the whole of us their use. Do you understand the difference I'm trying to impart?" Scene 4. Sinmo then gestured her to continue, and she went on, "I do." And her spirits rose enough to lift her face until their eyes met, and she went on, "I'm going to use some of my wages to buy you more when we go into port." Harker turned to the old man standing with his portly hands clenched to his round waist, and regarded him with confusion before he replied, "Well, I suppose—" Yes, thank you, Dara. That's very considerate. Now join the others and prepare for dinner," Sinmo commanded gently, and faced her towards her classmates. He explained hurriedly, "She needs to understand the value of money." Those children, still consumed by the book, battled over who would be so fortunate as to hold it, until Sol snatched it from them, for her maturity and power over them sprung to the front of their minds. "We are going to be civilized about this. You can go now, Moon and Sky." The girls examined the book with no discernible enthusiasm, but when they arrived at the drawing of a Bartholominian snow tiger, they could no longer obscure their delight with feigned indifference, and their cheeks plumped as their lips stretched into a wide smile, before they haphazardly tore the picture out and ran away, leaving the book to fall to the floor. Their colleagues shouted at them in disgust, and Sol alerted their teachers to the spectacle. As they disappeared behind a nearby curtain that covered their hammocks, Harker and Sinmo approached them, bewildered by their audacity. They peered around the curtain and discovered Moon and Sky eagerly stacking papers, including drawings, and some with words on them, all torn from Harker's books. "What have you done?" Harker exclaimed as he attempted to retrieve those lost pages. "We like these." They spoke with inscrutable faces, and Sky went on, "Mother says they are the gods' glories." "They certainly are," Sinmo admitted, moved by their untamed devotion to their faith. "Did you see many animals like these back home?" The girls shook their heads, but in an instant the vessel trembled with the voice of thunder, pummeled the still air around them, and stirred alive the terror of enemy cannons in their hearts. The whole of their charge collapsed into sobs until a moment passed, and their reason was restored, and they realized it was but the sound of inclement weather approaching. Firo appeared with rain drizzled upon his shoulders and head, and shouted at the instructors, "Captain wants to see you both." They peered through the humid darkness at one another that strengthened with the rain, and hurried up the steps in concert before knocking on her door. "Come in," they heard her say, and implying through her agreeable inflection no sins at sea had been committed by them. "Hello, Captain," they addressed her, and stood upright at attention. "How are the children after today?" she asked, glancing at them before shaking her head, discontented by the tragedy of Remelia's surrender to the gods, and turning back to the map on the table. "One might believe they are restored, except perhaps Vodstock. He has—" Harker began to explain. "That is good," she interrupted him, before she addressed Sinmo and appealed to his wisdom. "And what do you think?" "Well, I'd preach caution, Captain, if I may. When I lost my children—" Those friends they possessed did not understand they were to never see them again. They found me in a neighbor's home and visited this house every day for a week, asking when they might play once more. I was distraught, and to my regret I shouted at them until I was hoarse that they would never look upon their faces again. And I cried on the doorstep for nearly an hour before they departed, never to return. I grieved for their unknowing hearts more than my own. It pained me as much as my wife's death. However, these children come from Khufu, which shares its brutality for the poor. They have likely seen much death and are somewhat accustomed to it, given most are orphans in all but name. Thank you both for your insight, that is all. And she nearly waved them away before she began again. Look upon the horizon. She pointed through her darkening window in the rear of the room. We will not escape this storm, even at great speed. Have Rocco come see me. Harker and Sinwell were jarred at the abruptness of the conversation ending, and departed her quarters while awkwardly trying to say good night. Once they were on the deck again, they could see the moon over the ocean, and the vast oneness of the water and the horizon. It was unbroken and purple with the sunset. I'm sorry you suffered so, Harker offered sincerely, before resting his hand upon Sinmo's shoulder. The old man reached up and took his hand with immense affection, and his grief was reignited to an ember. We must carry on, trudge, crawl, march, whatever means will deliver you to feel joy once again. They would want that for their papa. My wife would not want me to wallow such as I did for so long. She looks upon me less annoyed, from the heavens. Those memories are quite tender. The teacher studied the old man's face and saw his thoughts consumed his attention. Yes, they are, he returned after a pause. But we have new responsibilities, new little ones to raise into soldiers that are smart and useful, warriors that might survive to secure freedom for themselves and others languishing under the pole marks. Is that all they have hoped to become? A soldier, a sailor. Harker lamented as he confronted his true contentions he had not revealed to anyone since he came aboard. If you aid a resistance by any method, worthy or trivial, you become a soldier. And there isn't a finer occupation when your country and its people desperately need them. Sinwell nodded at his own words that affirmed his long-held passions. I've given it much thought. I know that life in Khufu is bleak, but I know not why the boys decided to remain. We might never learn if they're still alive. They're so young, what can they possibly do? The children had no real choice between this ship and the country that let them become enslaved. I contend that enthusiasm to be on this ship is mildly coercive. What is it you want to say? Sinmo hushed him with a growl. Remelia's death. It was so violent. He was a boy. Harker allowed himself to weep silently, and Sinmo took him by the arm and led him away from the captain's door. I've seen the death of many children since coming aboard the Ravensword. We have saved them from all manner of trouble out on the sea, and enlisted them in precisely the same way. They trim and load and fight throughout the fleet now, some of them having their own command after learning to run a vessel under Captain Valara. Some will die, true, but some will live also. And these patriots will go on to do great things for their new country. Remelia's death was the first of many sacrifices we will see made for the endless pursuit of freedom for us and our peoples. His death was not in vain if we take back the homeland. As Sinmo spoke the last, his words rehearsed and weakly sustained by his unyielding patriotism, weighed his countenance into sheer disbelief and melancholy. His eyes fell to his feet, and Harker nodded meekly, but still reassuringly, as if to acknowledge the old man only uttered these pledges to appease the ghost of his grief. He knew the young boy would ever enjoy the company and serenity of death, but nothing more, and the instructor thought to bring to his companion's mind a more pleasant discourse. Have you ever seen Odin? Even from afar? He shook his head reluctantly, before sweetly recalling that which he had come to know. No, I haven't. But I've seen many maps and spoken to those native to it about life there, and so I feel quite familiar with my home. I've seen little of maps that speak to the state of society there. I've read the cities have been overwhelmed with refugees from the country, given the Polemarchs have relocated or killed most of the farmers and replaced them with their own barons. Students of government policy consider the occupation to be quite thorough. Do you have a plan of where you'll go if you drive them out? He studied the young man's face with a pleased expression. Are you coming with us? I've given it a little thought since Zango mentioned it to me earlier. Harker reciprocated his delight at the proposition and smiled. Perhaps I'm being hasty, but I'm considering remaining aboard the Ravensward, as I really have no reason to return to Caradris now that my parents are gone, and I'm living on my inheritance. You should not sit on money you did not earn. I'd think earning your plot of land after fighting for it would be superior for the spirit in your legacy, Sinmo exclaimed, subtly mocking his indecision on matters of courage. Is that what would be promised to me and my children? A plot of land. You know what they say about the fleet, outside the fleet about those promises. Sinmo ignored his reference to the criticism levied against his government and replied, Aye, amongst other things, if you're needing it. Our people will lend you what you need to build yourself a home. It would be a rickety edifice, I assure you. How could I sleep soundly with such a roof above me? I don't know anything about that. I never did that sort of labor as a boy. Harker withdrew from his good humor and shame at the mention of his incompetency in the trades. It's okay, friend. We will help you. I will, at any rate. The knowledge you have would be invaluable to the village you decided to settle in. His compliments were genuine, and he smacked the instructor's back, suggesting he would not go abandoned. Harker denied any desire for the task he named. I'd much prefer the company of a city and its library. I have no experience with farming, or what have you. I'm not sure I'd make a very good one. 'Tis true, the cities are the height of knowledge in Odin. It is often where the Jarls meet, so they are also the center of politics. And the academics spend all the time in the great libraries, such as the spherical construct of Midsomragar and the library of Heldragor, carved from the hollowed and hallowed mountain of Miracro. It is necessary to build a place where citizens can go to learn the sum of our experience. But the villages, many of the children spend a life doing labor that leaves them wanting as they face their death and old age, when they could have been architects, academics, doctors. Our nation as a whole suffers from their potential is wasted. That is not to say that digging ditches and the like is not noble work. Harker abruptly interrupted the old man's obligate efforts to restore the dignity of such mindless labor. What would you have me do? Travel, village to village, teach for a time, and then move on to another, and repeat the task there. Perhaps I'll come with you and attend also to your students' needs. Sinmo considered his words briefly, and his mind utterly devoted to his dreams of the good day they might do. He nearly wept in cheer, for no one in his decade of service had inspired such optimism in him. The old man prayed, casting his eyes towards the heavens, and silently embraced the gods for nourishing him against this resolve famished, and further trampled by time. Sinmo's abundance of zeal infected Harker, and he rejoined with delight at similar contentions for their shared future. I wonder if Odin's government would fund our venture. I suppose I could use my inheritance if they don't. It would take quite a long time to get it, though, as I'm only given a monthly allowance, and so I cannot withdraw it all at once. The old man denied the selfless scheme. That is no good. But maybe we can ask the captain. She seems to always get what she wants. He chuckled at the absurdity. Perhaps I will. The teacher did not detect he was being faintly sardonic at the notion. Do you want to find a wife? Sinmo asked, nudging him suggestively. There are many beautiful Odinite women. I'm sure they would welcome a prize such as yourself into a partnership. Husband or wife, Harker shrugged, attempting to dismiss the particulars he named. I care not which. What about you? Will you remarry? The old man peered at his aged palms and spun the gold ring on his left hand compulsively and nervously. No, I don't think so. I'm old and heavy in spirit. All of my love died with my wife and children. This can't be true. I see how you love these children every day. Harker motioned to below deck where the children napped peacefully in their hammocks. That is but a shadow, vanished from a rock, born of a flame extinguished that once burned so brightly. I could not lose everything again. I couldn't. Sinmo dissolved from considering the losses he had so far endured, and rejected the claim he might ever overcome the anguish that had burrowed deeply into his heart. I won't presume to know how you must feel, the teacher earnestly acknowledged. You have come to know it because of Romelia, but it will worsen until it improves with time, as the clarity of your memories is tarnished, which seems to accelerate as you age. Sinmo reminded him with grim amusement as his lips pursed in regret. Yes, I've heard that. Anyway. Harker rejoined as the last of the sun sank below the horizon and he moved to suggest, Shall we go to bed? Sinmo nodded. Let us check on the children first. Naturally. However, it was upon chance that he would later find Sinmo lingering on the edge of the ship and holding his member to perform the same task that brought him to the rear. Harker waited for the sake of manners and still, but the old man would grunt and huff before speaking abruptly. Just do what you gotta do. It ain't going to bite. You'll be here all night if you don't. After a few moments of indecision, Harker approached, and his animalian curiosity was suppressed as he gazed at the stairs and averted his eyes. Upon finishing, he stuffed himself away hurriedly, and realized Sinmo had not moved nor indicated any audible relief. Are you okay? He grunted with the pain inflicted by his one of many corporeal failings, and assured him unconvincingly, I'm fine. Just takes a long time to get started. I tried to think of the nectar of the dambabi fruit. It was a cure. But I've since abused the remedy until my supply ran dry, so now it comes out in drops. Sometimes I'm standing here for half an hour. Not a good look with this crew, but they understand. I'm familiar with that condition, and I'm happy to inform you I can likely purchase the necessary ingredients from any market to synthesize a tonic for you. It's derived from a plant that grows almost everywhere in the world. Most people actually consider it a weed. Harker was relieved his friend's troubles could be rendered inert with his help. I'd be so grateful, but I can't begin to understand how Dom is unaware of this alchemical. The old man hopped up and down and lightly stomped his feet at each descent to impose the unchanging will of gravity to assist in his task, before yanking his pants to his waist, disappointed in embracing his beloved friend. I have no idea. Harker backed away chuckling and dismissed the expertise levied by the suggestion. I'm no doctor, but I've learned a little about treating some maladies. When I was younger, I tutored a boy named Demilios Arkanzos on Khufu, and when he caught the vial, he was taken to a place where the infected were kept. Not everyone there was being treated for the incurable disease, and so I learned a little about the treatment of a variety of patients born from my desire to help the doctors in caring for them. I'm ashamed to say, I divined the plan with the aim of gaining knowledge, not from any measure of compassion. Bollocks. The old man spit on the deck in apparent refusal, and Harker laughed heartily, flattered and entertained by Sinmo's classless gesture. I was young, too young to look upon their faces and recognize their humanity. They were nothing more than their affliction, merely patients sharing not the burden of identity with their former lives. My contentions I rationalized when a criminal meant for prosecution and hanging took refuge amongst us. He had fallen ill, and no one charged with his arrest wanted to endanger themselves touching him. He declined us any effort to prolong his life, and died in immense pain and fever laying in a bed alone. In my brief time there, the scars from the vial delivered its many bearers to accept their death, and some even preferred it in the end. My children were unrecognizable to me by the end, Sinmo declared, his voice absent the consolation awarded by time, and descending into a morose state. Your soul does not mend. It only comes to better endure the suffering prescribed by your experiences. You become accustomed to it. The old man touched his own cheek tenderly before he went on. I'm older than the captain, and all those trespasses I've survived in my long life wrought by my mother or father, by my wife or my friends, either false or genuine. You never entirely escaped the bewilderment that arose from their actions that wounded you. You wonder in everlasting torment, why? What have I done to deserve these injuries of the spirit? What gods did I scorn? Even as an old man, my breath is stilled when I ponder why I was so worthy of their betrayal. You beg to know how they could scheme against you. Do you know of what I speak? Would you call me pathetic? Old and bitter salt? Harker remained motionless before he shook his head, and Sinmo saw his colleague wore a countenance of faint familiarity with the notions he referred to. I began to suspect the truth of your words when I neared the age of 30, almost a decade ago. Sinmo nodded and sighed when the teacher addressed him again. Is that why you elected to leave your country and enlist in the Odinites? No. But perhaps I'll tell you one day why I came aboard the Ravensward, but it will not be today, for I'm tired and I'm still trying to piss. He chuckled as he returned to the edge of the ship and drew his trousers down again. Harker smiled and bid, "Good night, Sinmo," before he patted him on the back as he departed. Scene 5. He lay awake amidst the muted snoring of the young and yet developed lungs of the children, wondering what his life would hold if he settled in Odin. He had seen nothing of the nation, save a rare painting of a Jarl's house. It was built like a temple constructed from red wood and black stone. And despite the more than 70 crew members aboard the ship, many of them were foreigners who were not unlike him, as they had never set foot nor eye upon Odin's soil. The land they were promised for participating in the liberation of the Odinites from Polmark's occupation might as well be the hammocks he lay in, given the country has been occupied for 15 years. But his erudition on other matters of history, such as the current strife in Wooloo and all its territories, and how the Empire was made to surrender its gained territories to local and untrained militia forces. He was nourished with succor in the thought the captain could rally neighboring allies to their cause, if they merely had the forces to ensure victory while attacking from the shore. But when he turned his thoughts to the children sleeping soundly beside him, he agonized over the doom certain to find them before they might ever discover the indispensable feeling of knowing they are useful to their society. Romelia died only 2 weeks after coming aboard the Ravensward. His vast imagination, informed by the pain of history, only granted him security when he considered they would be safe in the company of the fleet. But what if the captain decided to hunt slavers and pirates again after the meeting is over? Her fixation for the fall of those fiends had encouraged peril to visit her crew again and again, expending the virtue of their courage for innocence abroad. Before it occurred to him he was tired, he was asleep. Sinmo returned below deck and sighed before lying down. He too was snoring in short time, and was awoken at dawn by Zango's voice. "Land ho!" They had arrived at last on the island called Detrimus, with the purpose of refilling their supplies. "I hate this place," Zango shuddered as she spoke to Firo. Firo was eager, and did not mask this fact as he responded, "I love it. I love a good fight, and you can be sure there's going to be one. Oh, the captain's letting you go between the stones armed. You've changed the heart of a rock, you keen negotiator. Ain't no one innocent that visits between the stones, so of course I told the captain as much, and given we got little ones with us now, she says I get to bring my sword." Firo inspected the gold hilt of the Wooloo dagger and said as he rubbed at the metal with the sleeve of his shirt, "Blasted scuff marks, I need to get her properly polished." Zango was unconvinced by his assurances, and moved to make known her reservations, but the former knight interrupted her preemptively. "I'm going to behave myself, as long as no one says anything stupid to me or my crew." "You're wanted in Karajas for the same thing," Ced laughed at his hastiness. "The man shouldn't have made a joke about Rocco being deaf. Lots of folks upon the sea ain't no different. I was defending their honor too. I've never been more certain when I say this, but Rocco can stand up for himself." Zango shook her head in disbelief, and amused by Firo's boldness and recklessness of heart. The former knight countered, exclaiming, "It was his father that said it to him. Our first mate became but a boy, whimpering and tears and all." "His dad must be big," Ced guessed as he looked Rocco up and down from afar. Firo nodded and drew his face to a pinch in regret and irritation at the events his friend brought to mind. "Aye, he was a right big one. Took me ages to get him drunk enough so it'd be a fair fight. Cost me a month's wages." As he sauntered off, a parcel of air gathered in his breast, and he tittered so audibly it drew a number of curious stares from the nearby crew. He then noticed Sol ascending the stairs from her compartment, and he caught her. "Oi, where do you think you're off to?" "I'm going to look around. I haven't seen land in a month." She had learned to appeal to Firo's want for adventure, and she went on, "You can come if you'd like." No, you're not here, you're not. Not off, none of that going off on your own. This ain't the place for that. Another city, maybe, like Cowran's Peak or Fidrapor, but this here is Detrimus, so named by the old king of the pirates, and these two stones Detrimus, and it's dark between them. We came here because we had to. Captain might have sailed by without even looking at her otherwise. Listen. And he bent towards her, inspiring fear in her as he intended. Stay close. These pirates know that attacking an Odinite will bring the fist of the fleet upon them if they get froggy. And am I not an Odinite now? Sol interrupted him and inadvertently unearthed Firo's rarely employed look of disbelief. If I am, then they won't hurt me. Firo suppressed his laughter at her ignorance and corrected her perilous assumptions. Them rules is for places with law. Ain't no laws here, Sol. Now I know you're grown, but that's precisely the crux of my troubles with you going off on your own. You're grown. Wouldn't nobody between the stones refrain from doing something terrible to you? Lonely women here don't want for company long, if you get my meaning. Ain't no place for the like. Now, watch your purse. They don't say nothing about stealing from Odinites. He extended his hand. You promise to stay with us? She smiled and nodded with the aim of dispelling his fear, but it had no effect, and his unyielding anxiety provoked immense unease in her stomach. The girl spoke after an awkward pause between them. Should we wait for the captain? I don't want you to worry. She can protect us. Firo was superficially wounded by her joke and winced at his earlier shameful performances against Captain Villar before he laughed, embarrassed by the truth she uttered. She will come when she's ready. Suddenly, the captain appeared from her quarters, armed with her sword and axe at her hips. Everyone fell silent as she walked past and down the ramp to the docks below. Let's go get a drink, she exclaimed with novel cheer. The crew cheered and followed her to the Crab Cakes pub. As they left the docks, they trudged along the beach for a spell in the shadow of a lone boulder. At last they were in the sunlight again, and her eyes widened at the sight of two boulders nearing 15 stories in height, with flattened walls that shaded a city sheltered between them. There were shops and pubs and inns and all manner of tradesmen scattered throughout and stacked upon one another. A path was trampled by the traffic of drunken sailors and pirates and ne'er-do-wells of all stripes, and reinforced by imported cobblestone that lined the edges. Street lamps were erected and lit at all hours, as the sunlight hardly reached the bottom where they would soon walk. Sol asked Firo as the air cooled and wind funneled along the street before them, "Why is it called the Crab Cakes Pub?" "You know, perhaps you got too much imagination. Use your sense, girl. It's just a little pub that makes big crab cakes, as big as a pie," he responded, grinning, as they entered through the beaded curtain at the edge of the city. Upon the tables that were lit by chandeliers constructed of a great grouper bone were the fried cakes oozing what appeared to be a peppered white gravy. There was no variety of dishes being served, merely the giant crab cakes from which they derived the name of the pub. Is it really that good? Sol was intrigued to taste it, as despite the abundance of the creature served also in Khufu, she was rarely granted the opportunity to enjoy it as they were heavily taxed. And her father suffered a mild allergy to the shellfish. "Shut your mouth, heathen. Ain't nothing finer than the crab cakes diner," he snickered at his own rhyme, and continued eagerly. "It's filling, and it's fried. I love it, and you'll love it too, or I'll throw you overboard in a crab trap when we get back to the ship." She shoved him weakly and laughed before examining the faces of the crew. "Where's the other crew? The Skullyoung?" "They're back at their ship. They don't usually leave their vessel when they come into port. They send someone out to get what they want to drink and eat and bring it back. I figure they're fighting the urge to eat someone. They're famous for that, you know." Sol shook her head, and then her eyes lit up. "You're teasing me." "No, honest to the gods. Ask Simo if you figure I'm fibbing." Firo's lips drew upwards in convincing disgust at the notion as he scanned the room. She deflated when she noticed a handful of men were staring at her with indifference. Then they returned to eating. However, as her nose captured the odor of the fried food, she was struck by a sensation in her lower abdomen. A cramp twisted her innards, and then she keenly felt a warm dripping down her leg. Her eyes noticeably ballooned with shock before she tapped Firo on the shoulder. "I have to go back to the ship. Now." The former knight recoiled in surprise. "You want to leave now, before you've eaten? Goodbye." And she hurried off alone into the intermittent darkness. Sol paused to examine her pants in an empty alleyway, and she could discern there was blood in the black fabric. She raced further to the edge of the stones, and after a few moments, arrived at the dock and ascended the ramp to the ship. Sinmo was standing at the top discussing something with Harker when they both turned at the sound of her approaching hastily. "What's wrong?" they inquired jointly. She spread her hands in front of her groin, and Sinmo gasped. Oh dear. Okay. I'm sorry, my dear. I've some experience with my wife." What on earth are you talking about? Harker had not been cured of his ignorance, and Sinmo could not spare a moment to oblige him. Just shut up and find a woman. They're at the Crab Cakes pub. Sinmo barked at the teacher. Where is that? He asked, his voice frantic and deprived of confidence. The second floor. Big sign. Use your eyes. Ask someone in the city if you get lost. Sinmo followed Sol below deck and apologized on Harker's behalf. As she waited in private, he delivered a change of clothes and some tea Fritz made especially for her in the event she suffered terrible pain, as she had come to find many women were made to endure every change of the moon. Harker departed from the ship and headed down the docks until he ended up in the sunlit beaches. He saw the massive boulders in the edge of the city jutting out from the gap in the center. He was astonished by the architecture, which would be considered structurally unsound in most cities. It was a city in the midst of perpetually improvised construction, with no rhyme in its arrangement. He passed several pirates as he made his way to the first floor of the city before he approached them. Would you happen to know where the Crab Cakes pub is? One of the pirates pointed and grunted before Harker thanked them and went on his way. He passed a brothel called Palantino's with two women standing outside pulling at him as he walked by. A man of much greater proportions stepped in front of him and regarded him with suspicion. You! Harker retreated 2 steps in fear as he studied the large man's face. Hello. I'm just trying to find my crew. I'm with the Odinites. The Ravensword? Hello. He repeated himself as he discovered deeply embedded in his memory was this man's face. I've seen you before. How do I know you? His eyes peered down at him with expectant rage. You been to Caradhras? I'm an Odinite. Harker reinvoked his license to pass unmolested, but the big man was unmoved by his declarations, and his eyes began to tear with fright. The man's face was stern as he nearly whispered, I heard you. I'm Palantino. You remember me? He shoved Harker backwards and commanded, Girls, hold him here for a minute. His accomplices gripped him by the arms and shoved him against the wall as the man left into the house behind him and returned with a leather journal. What's your name? He growled. The teacher sighed and collapsed into a monument of grief over his former life of recklessness and spoke truthfully, as he knew any deception would only end in further abuse. Harker Eniolo. Palantino scanned each page with a finger traveling down along the names and numbers before he tapped the book with a heavy thud. Here you are. 800 gold coins. And here it says, you're 2 years late on your payments. Essie. He turned to one of the women that held him. What's 40% on 800 gold coins every month for 24 months? She touched her chin pensively and answered him in a moment later. 8,480, if and you include the principal. Of course it includes the principal, he hollered menacingly and spitting on Harker's boots. It's so fortunate you've come to pay your debts. No chance you'd like to make a wager for a chance to absolve you, double or nothing? The man imposed a greater shadow onto the teacher, and he felt his back hit the wall. Harker remained indecisive for too long, and Palantino winded up and struck him across the face, casting his glasses to the ground. He wanted not to betray his captain's orders against gambling, but would surrender to his terror rather than his honesty to the doom he felt he had inflicted upon himself. Palantino smirked as he stepped away and stamped his foot to crush the spectacles. They shattered utterly beneath his weight, and his wicked countenance was blurred by Harker's poor vision, and the teacher cried, You broke my glasses! Shut up, you bitch! He returned with insidious delight as he kicked him in the groin, and then thrust his knee into his face before reaching down and taking the pouch of gold coins dangling from the teacher's hip. Harker rolled upon the ground, agonizing over his throbbing nose which bled unceasingly. His now bloodied hands cupped his injured member tenderly as he coughed violently and struggled to draw a full breath. Palantino at last walked away, gratified by the measure of his strength, and erected himself near his employees, now giggling and leaning against the wall beside him. The blood clumped on his hands when it met the loose, dusty soil, and he lifted himself from the ground weakly. He stumbled across the street with Palantino's voice taunting him. You better be getting the rest. The women cackled as they considered the absurd notion the Odinites would dock at Detrimus. Harker approached each building, and absent sight fitting of the task, he was compelled to enter each and briefly examine the patrons for signs of his comrades. He would discover them chanting a song in unison as he tried to stem the bleeding from his face. The teacher then discovered his lips were torn down the middle, and after he dabbed them and licked the blood away, he noticed at last the sign for the Crab Cakes pub. In a sense, he felt he had failed his captain and his crew. She had forbidden him from gambling, and despite him not doing so since accepting a position on their ship, those perceived failures of his past moral character starkly demonstrated the sins of his former life would arrest and annihilate any joy he had achieved from his abstinence. He stepped through the beaded curtain with his head back and plugged his nostrils with cloth torn from his shirt. Captain Valara's gaze fell upon him immediately, and she rose with such potent fury and concern. The remainder of the crew stopped eating and leapt to their feet. Seth approached him cautiously, examining his injuries. "You need to see Dom. Who did this to you?" Harker wept with shame, and the muscles near his nose contracted and drew more tears from his eyes. "I tried to tell him I was an Odinite. Someone named Palantino." "Palantino?" Firo stood up upon his toes to see more clearly what he had done to him, and his breathing quickened with rage. "It was a man. He had a red shirt with long sleeves. It was a brothel of the same name. We know who he is. What were you doing at a brothel?" Zengo inquired, trying to depart from her amusement at the thought of the teacher paying for intimate company. "Captain," his face was pinched as blood swelled his nose further as he confessed, "I owed him money from gambling debts. It was a long time ago. I swear I did not violate your orders." The captain scrutinized him for a moment and signaled the crew to leave. Her voice made no allusions to a lack of faith in his assurances, and she ordered him while resting a hand on his shoulder, "Stay here and watch the food. We'll take care of this." Once he was alone, he could not refrain from exposing himself to onlookers as meek and ill-fitted for the life he elected to live. He seated himself beside the half-eaten meals while 24 members of his crew started to the brothel, and came to a halt when they looked upon the 2 women who briefly imprisoned him. When their eyes met with Captain Valara's, they sprinted inside, shouting for Palantino and slamming the door behind them. As they scrambled to bar the door, Firo shot his foot into the space near the knob, and it yielded to his strength. Essie and her colleague collapsed on the floor and screamed in terror as Zango and Firo cut their throats without indecision. Palantino sprinted up the stairs at the sight of their brutal scowls, and the crew commenced the chase with hearty laughter at his expense. Firo gained ground swiftly, but the man leapt through a closed window, and the glass shards carved slits in his face and arms. His scalp bled profusely and dripped into his eyes, rendering him nearly blind as he pleaded for mercy and ran through the growing darkness. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, please stop." From his seat, and as his spirit wallowed in its disrepair, Harker heeded the commotion born from vicarious revenge just outside the beaded curtain. Palantino was coming nearer to him, sprinting with a face masked by the blood born from his conduct as he had surrendered to fear. As he came clear to the teacher with his approach, Captain Valara winded her axe from her hip and threw it at the perpetrator, and after but an instant, he collapsed onto the ground in front of Harker, with the axe buried deep in the back of his skull. The remainder of their crew arrived a few minutes later, panting from the pursuit. Firo slapped the teacher on the shoulder as he rested his other on his knee and leaned over. "Now, we know that wasn't your fault, but next time if you're going to get hit by somebody that won't run." Scene 6. Harker nodded and sobbed in secret at the result of their devotion to him. In his life, he had never inspired such resolve in others, and despite their merciless convictions, he was nearly spared the guilt of Palantino's death. The teacher seated himself silently at the edge of the table as his comrades returned to their meals. They devoured the cakes and discussed with glee their recollections of the chase, laughing at the brothel owner's expense and how he had doomed his final moments to blindness by leaping through the glass window to injurious effect. His colleagues occasionally slapped him on the back and assured him no further danger would befall him if they could help it. But their jubilance would be halted when Captain Valara stood upon noticing a crew of nearly 40 pirates appeared on the opposite side of the street armed with swords. "Odinites! Come out of there!" a short man with a peg leg hollered with a bird-like squeal. The pub's patrons whispered the words just uttered in surprise as they looked on. Captain Valara stabbed her last bite of crab cake and sopped it with remaining gravy on her plate, and casually finished before she stood. As she wiped her face with her sleeve, she tossed a bag of gold in front of the bartender. She then examined the faces of her crew, and they jumped to their feet, cackling. Firo grinned as he unsheathed his sword and let it rest on his shoulder prior to stepping through the beaded curtain with his captain in tow. "You killed Palantino," many of them uttered in concert, and their declaration grew a greater unfriendly audience from nearby establishments. "He struck one of my crew," Captain Villar said briefly, examining the onlookers for any sudden hostility. A small, obese man with a long and dirty black beard approached the Odinites, his wooden peg leg clacking on the cobblestone as he went, and he squealed, pointing at the dead brothel owner. "That man there was family to us." "So to us is the man he attacked," Villar declared as she pointed at the bloodied face of her resident instructor. The pirate took another step towards them. "Do you know who I am? Who we are?" Captain Villar regarded him with disgust and irritation before sighing. "I've killed a healthy number of evil little fuckers with peg legs. I don't remember their names, and I likely won't remember yours either." The pirate captain harumphed before he exclaimed, "We are the Bandit Quill Pirates. I'm Captain Muncha." "We're Clan Volsung of the Odinites," she rejoined coolly while crossing her arms with defiance in her countenance. "I lost my leg to an Odinite ship," Muncha shrieked with a crooked scowl. "We train our cannoneers very well," she delighted in his injury, and considered sweeping his wooden leg out from under him to send him into the mud. While greatly outnumbered, the Odinites carefully maneuvered into a defensive formation. Captain Muncha yanked his sword from its sheath, a curved, shining blade with a dark gold hilt and a petite red gem in the center. His crew armed themselves while staring at them with malice in their expressions. The little man then blew a horn, and several dozen other pirates appeared in the streets with their weapons drawn. "Back to the ship!" Captain Villar shouted her cry of retreat, and the whole of the Ravensward that stood near raced to the ship through the darkened street. As they escaped the slim corridor of the city, the sunlight fell upon their faces and they hollered triumphantly, taunting their pursuers with laughter as their ship came into view. The Bandicoot pirates trailed far behind, charging and shouting, but they lacked the speed to apprehend their chase before they arrived at their vessel. On the Skuljung ship, a lone man looked out onto the sandy beaches and witnessed the beloved Captain Villara and her crew sprinting towards him, and their mortal enemies stumbling with exhaustion far behind them. He sprinted to the deck bell and rang it wildly and without rhythm. The entire Skuljung crew appeared in an instant, and when they comprehended what was occurring, they cackled at the notion of glory and death, and immediately leapt down to the pier to meet the Bandit Quill pirates in battle. Harker did not know his heart was capable of driving him to such lengths, but as he ascended to the deck, he quickly collapsed in the door of his captain's quarters and lay panting as the killing began. Sinmo rose from the crew's living compartment armed with a blade and dragged the instructor to where he and the children were hiding. He killed 2 pirates aiming to exact vengeance on Harker, and soaked the teacher's clothes in the blood that spilled from their eviscerated stomachs. The Skuljung pounced on them from the rear and began killing the attackers en masse. Several of these vicious companions swarmed their enemies and employed their teeth to tear their ears and noses from their opponents' faces, and bit deeply into their necks. A shrieking noise originated from the Skuljung ship then sounded, and an Odinite was witnessed holding an instrument that when he blew into it, it produced a cacophony nearly identical to the unnerving utterance of a woman screaming at some terror unseen. However, it only seemed to draw more pirates out that fought to defend the Bandicoot crew. Dozens of brigands poured out onto the beaches from between the stones and scrambled across the beach towards them. Suddenly, flaming arrows were fired into the sails of the Skuljung ship. On the beach far off was a team of archers, setting more arrows aflame and sending them into their sails. The wanton blaze spread rapidly as the pirates continued to ascend the ramp to their ships. Captain Valaris suspected the whole of Detrimus might be upon them at any moment, and peered upwards when she noticed at last the masts were burning. "Firo!" she shouted as she slipped his sword into the belly of a pirate. His eyes darted towards the sound of her voice, and she barked, "Fire the cannons at those archers!" A sword came down upon him, but he deflected it and cut the throat of his attacker. "Aye," he rejoined nodding, and he rushed below deck, panting. Enlisting several others with mastery of the task, they loaded the cannons and fired them at their attackers. After a moment, the balls bounced effortlessly upon the beach before removing the heads and limbs of several of their enemies. The remainder of the archers scrambled away at sight of their decapitated comrades, but the Skuljung's sails were still aflame, and the captain knew the ship would certainly be consumed with them. The fire spread down the main mast, and the crow's nest was burning. She looked at her crew still fighting off the pirates and commanded those near and far, "Bring them to our ship." Firo found most of the children sitting with Harker and Sinmo as he ordered, "Move back, move everything back. We're making a run for it. The other crew's joining us." Harker and Sinmo's eyes widened, and they both stood. They started scrambling about before they said, "Children, help us move some things." On the Remnarok, the Skuljung distributed books and parchments along with everything else useful and small enough to lumber, and ascended to the rear of the ship. As the crew fought, the Skuljung placed a ramp that ran from their ship to the Volsungs, and the bloodied veteran crew grudgingly crossed over. They stood on the deck briefly before following the lit lanterns into the main hold. They could see the Remnarok burning with the smoke rising high. The entire crew had already been evacuated, and the Skuljung still fighting were making their way onto the Volsung's ship. After a time, Captain Valara was running above and below deck, accounting for her crew until she spoke with the Skuljung's captain, and he nodded before he commanded Rocco to set sail. As they drifted away, they could see more appearing and looking over the bodies of the dead. Neither the Volsung nor the Skuljung lost any crew members in the battle, but the loss of a ship was devastating to their ability to make their journey to their fleet. With only one vessel, they would have to stop more often at ports to resupply, and not all of those ports are going to be friendly to Odinites. Some are just as, or even more dangerous than Detrimus. Skuljung knocked on the door to the captain Valara's quarters. "Come in," she said. He entered and grunted. "I was bound to help you. If I left the admiral's daughter to die at the hands of some bloody pirates, it would be me and my crew paying the price. Now my ship is gone. How are you going to make me and my crew whole again?" "Captain Vortol," she stood to her feet, and as her dark eyes fell upon him, their weight unyielding brought him to wince. "I see you're injured." He scowled and instinctively shielded his wound carved in his aged bicep. "Ain't nothing." He spit at the floor and stumbled away as his battle fury left him slowly, and his heart tamped its quickening. "Just a scratch." He slid his black cape with iron pauldrons from his back and revealed his wounded and decrepit frame, spotted by the sun with melanomas expanding irregularly on his face, ribbed on the cheeks, and around the eyes by deeply carved wrinkles. When she beheld the blood that dripped from his fingertips, Captain Valara walked past and opened the door slightly and whispered to a crew member on the opposite side, "Get Dom. Bring him here." She shut the door and brought the old captain a chair to rest. As he collapsed into it, he groaned and studied her face, but discovered nothing of her motives for her compassion. "I'm glad we ran into you," he confessed, and searched for further utterances to justify his compliment. Captain Valara was faintly moved by his admission, and she returned the compliment. "I haven't seen the Skuljung in battle in many years. You remain the most fearsome of Odin." "Aye," he laughed, but his injured flesh contracted and shot pain through his arm as he growled, "My kids know how to fight. But you're built of the same stuff, you're a Magramon." Reminded of her days amongst the Skuljung, she recalled the pride and delight in her father's countenance when she returned from her trials, not only alive, but triumphant as well. 12 of the 20 children that set out would survive along with her. Mogramon was a heavily featured compliment passed from the elders to the new champions. The closest, yet still faintly unflattering translation for the word is bog monster, an endearing reference to the earliest memories of their civilization when they resided in the wetlands of the territory, upon being forced by the Odinites that successfully annexed their lands. Captain Vortol examined the maps hanging on the wall and muttered, "You got children with you." She nodded and leaned beside the door. "They're part of my crew now. They're in service to Odin." "A lot of good they did you," he shot back with a sudden grin emerging. "A couple of them look to show promise. Who's that tall, skinny fellow? Fainted at your doorstep." He threw his hands upon a table to simulate his fall. "The Pogger. Harker Iniolo of Reveria. He replaced Jesus, my instructor from Brelian. He was killed some years ago in a skirmish with Bandicoot pirates." She offered a moment of silence to consider his life and went on somberly. "He and these charges have served well so far." "They're hardly charges at the moment. They're hardly anything. They look so starved. I bet you wouldn't get more than a few pounds of meat from any of them." The sinister implications of the last might have provoked the good captain, but she took a hefty swig of wine to mute her choler for the present. "We found them in prison on a slaver ship almost 2 months ago. She sucked the wine from her teeth contemptuously. And you think they're going to become great patriots for our country, do you? His recreation for prodding Captain Valara had exhausted her patience, and he surrendered with his eyes cast downward. I know you're right. Hatsuru's proof of that. You hear he's getting married. Nice girl, good parts. One half of her nose swung to her glaring eyes in disgust, and his anxious gaze darted around the room awkwardly. I only mean... And as he went to correct his departure from decent conversation, Dom entered the room after a brief knock, not awaiting her permission to enter when he heeded Captain Vortal's voice amongst hers. He switched to the Skulljunk's language of Shikan. Dom examined the old captain's body and began treating his wounds with an antibacterial paste made from the roots of a bogormio tree, and followed this task with stitching them closed hastily. We will need to stop twice as often to resupply, and so it will take much longer to reach the fleet. I'm still captain of my crew, but my crew is your crew until we're back on our own, he muttered grudgingly and winced as the needle penetrated the skin on his bicep. Dom took no notice of the foreign utterances. She did not pursue further scolding him and instead said, I won't order you around. I know you better than that. Given we're all crammed on board here, our next destination is Niobe? Aye, she began as she locked her chair at her table in place and sat as the boat rocked. Niobe is little better than Detrimus, so everyone will stay aboard when we dock, and we will send a few out to get us food, drinks, and supplies. I'm not going to jeopardize the last vessel we have that will get us back home. He nodded before addressing Dom quietly. Help an old man with his boots, huh? And once removed, he turned back to the captain and was delighted to inquire, what happened in Detrimus? Captain Valara explained all the events as she recalled them. The Skulljon captain was pleased with the tale and the sport the bandit quill made for his crew. Having been unable to provide them with entertainment for several months whilst out at sea, his feeble heart brought out on a fit of coughing when he laughed uproariously at Harker's misfortune and the death of Palantino. Without the credentials of a practiced polyglot, Dom was astounded by the fluency of her Jikon. He was unable to identify a single word they exchanged, but he smiled as he watched her, as the language had the amusing property of always giving confused onlookers the impression the speakers were rather cross. However, as you, dear reader, will be made aware instead of the good doctor, their conversation never departed from their mutual grace and strategy expounded. We gave more than we got. I'm proud of our crews. Wouldn't you agree, Captain? Not a soul of ours was torn from our ranks. The Admiral ain't going to send Northen for losing a single ship with no one on it. The dumb bastards would have gone by now by the time they got here anyhow. The old man harumphed and proceeded to bob his head as if to nod again, and again as he came to agree with his own words, surprised by their lucidity. She nodded at the tottering creature, so advanced in age. What hair he did possess was often frail and lonely, as it drooped upon his pale and sun-spotted skin that lay stretched like old rubber over his shrunken bones, and nearly translucent in the light of the lamp. What were you doing in the Midris Ocean when we found you? Our navigator, Vixier, dropped dead on us. He was talking to me, and in mid-sentence he stopped, and then collapsed to the floor, and he was dead. Didn't seem to be nothing wrong with him. He weren't ill. We were lost, sailing blind for the last few days until we found you. She considered his words and expended the remainder of her sympathy to say, We're glad we found you. And as Dom leaned back to examine his work, Captain Valara went on, I'd be alone now, though. You can take Rocco's room if you like. He's first mate. I'll sleep amongst my crew if it's all the same to you. And he nearly collapsed as the blood rose to his head when he stood too rapidly. He gripped the door frame, referencing with an exasperated groan that his dignity had been rendered lame by time, and his once peerless vigor was eclipsed by the youth of his company, of which he had grown weary. The doctor sprightly advanced a single step to prepare for catching him if he fell before he left through the door, but he only stumbled and vanished into the all-consuming darkness outside. Scene 7. As Captain Valara visited the crew's quarters, she discovered the Skullzung had relegated most of the Ravensward crew to sleep in a small corner unfit for comfortable rest. Her expression grew stern as her collar rose, but she knew she could not intervene on their behalf without neutering them in the minds of their new comrades. However, her eyes met with Rocco's, and in response to her silent beseechment, He shoved his way to the center of the room and drew an invisible line with his finger and shouted them with his weighty, deft tongue. But rather than retreat, the Skoljang snickered and parted in concert to make way for their most physically imposing crew member, Diamond. He surpassed Rocco in height, but appeared exceedingly thin in comparison. The Skoljang giant lifted his hand and taunted the first mate by rubbing his bald head, prompting him to annihilate his worth as a warrior publicly. But with the back of his hand, Rocco blackened his eye and cheek while casting him into the crew's embrace. The legends of the crew that had alleged of Rocco's strength were proven utterly when he gripped the bigger man by his meager thighs and tossed him over his shoulder. The Volsung celebrated and cackled at the witnessing Skoljang, who were not remotely bitter in their defeat. Instead, they too joined in their mirth, and collectively called for throwing their giant overboard. But Rocco captured his opponent's ear and whispered. It was then the two giants turned on their comrades and began tossing overboard those who encouraged the rotten menace. Rocco clapped hands with Diamond and lifted their fists, laughing victoriously. Captain Vortal watched from afar and delighted in the contest before ordering his crew to board a skiff and rescue the imps from the abyss. The event prompted both sides to concede the hostility and join together for dinner in the galley. Fritz imparted to them she would not suffer the greed of the Skoljang's bellies, and they would eat only what was furnished for them. Harker and Sinmo remained in the main cabin reorganizing their teaching supplies to accommodate the new crew members. Those foreign to the children that departed from the galley sat in the light of the lamp and whispered with a language that suggested a menacing mood, and all of their utterances were wholly unknown to Harker, and it brought him to the brink of unease as they watched them in return. "What are they saying?" he inquired to his jolly accomplice. "I don't know, but it's their native tongue. It's called Jikan." The old man glanced at the title of a book, trying to discern the words and leaning into the light. "The captain can speak it." "How did she learn to speak Jikan? Ask her." Sinmo chuckled at his own jest, but his amusement was severed when Harker started for the stairs to the deck. "I will," and he disappeared to find his captain. Sinmo nearly scrambled to stop him, but he heard the young man addressing her a moment later. "Captain, hello," he began with a smile. "Yes, Harker," Captain Villar rejoined as she examined the fortune of darkness lingering beyond the lights, dangling from the edges of their ship, that could only be abolished some hours later by the rising sun. "I've heard some of the Skoljang crew speaking a language of which I'm not familiar." He attempted to steer his inquiry so that she might find his curiosity to be academic in nature and not provoked by invasive apprehension. "You want to know what they're saying? And Sinmo told you I can understand them." She smirked without returning his gaze. "Well, yes, Captain, but I'm most keen on learning how you were able to practice the language. With such disdain for outsiders, even other Odinites, it seems strange you would speak their native tongue with the fluency that it's purported." She elucidated her brief history with proportionate conceit. "My father sent me to live with them for 5 years as part of a peace agreement. I lived as they do. Many other Odinite children came with me. I wasn't alone. I pray you don't find offense, but they seem to possess great deference for you. Is it due to the trials? Sinmo said you survived them." His voice descended with his confidence as he considered she may not be eager to answer questions at so late an hour. She sighed, and with exhaustion weighing her inflection, "It is by the grace of propitious nepotism that I participated in the trials. Part of the agreement shielded children from other regions of Odin from being made subject. But given where I was suspected to end up in the fleet, I could not refuse." "You aim to prune your glory, Captain, and so I must reject your humility." He suspected she would not divulge how the trials were conducted, even for the sake of academic retrospection. He studied the axe at her hip and noticed it bore identical symbols to those that were carved into the side of the now sunken Skoljang vessel. "This is marvelous craftsmanship." She lifted her axe and brought it to his eye. "The Skoljang blacksmith made it after I passed my final trial. The engravings on it allude to the battles one might face amidst those hardships." As he scanned the instrument, he was briefly transported to the moment this same axe buried itself into Palantino's skull. His breath quickened as he beheld a picture of a wolf formed by straight lines that inspired recollections of ancient weapons and tombs of old from the Eastern Hemisphere. Another corner portrayed the moon with a rather beautiful tree that seemed to bear no canopy. and the branches were bare, but not thin and frail as if it were suffering a harsh winter, and instead in the image of early springtime growth. "What is this tree?" he inquired with his nose nearly touching the metal. "The ever-blooming tree. It sprouts those irregular leaves every season a different color. It is also ancient, and has been the center of Skjoldung culture for as long as anyone remembers. I've seen only the one in all my years traveling." "It's beautiful." He admired it sincerely before withdrawing and smiling at her. She placed it at her hip impatiently. "Don't you have work to do?" "Aye, Captain." And he departed hurriedly to find Sinmo and gleefully reveal what he had learned. Sinmo was flabbergasted and leaned in to whisper anxiously, "What did she say?" "What did you say?" Harker grinned at him before chuckling enigmatically as he left to return to his duties. Firo had settled alone in a compartment where heat for the interior of the ship was delivered. Two Skjoldung sat before him silently chewing on sweet sap as the former knight inquired hesitantly about how they enjoyed the battle. "I tell you, I've trained troops all over Wooloo, and I've never seen anyone fight the way you lot did today." They laughed, celebrating their recent mutilations, and retrieved the trophies from a leather pouch at their waists they had amputated from their foes. 2 ears, a finger, and a tongue. "Don't eat that. Please don't eat that." But their lips parted as they recovered it from an open flame, and he raced from his seat, efforting not to vomit. The Skjoldung stabbed a dagger through the drying tongue and placed it in their mouths and chewed vigorously. The men grinned at one another and inspected the remainder of their meal eagerly as it cooked over the fire. They laughed heartily as they began to sing. Firo leaned over the edge of the ship on the deck and saw Ced and Zango talking to Captain Vortol at the bow of the ship. Captain Valara left her quarters abruptly and instructed her present crew, "You three have first watch." Firo turned to his superior. "Aye, Captain." She nodded and walked away, leaving Firo, Ced, and Zango looking at one another, and then out into the blackness just beyond the light of their hanging lamps. But suddenly, off in the distance, but near enough to alarm everyone aboard, a booming sound shattered the rhythm of the vessel, striking the sea moved by high winds. The sky was lit by an explosion, and then another, until a cacophony of explosions and the clouds captured the light from the blasts. Captain Vortol scrambled to them with the haste of an old man, and stared at the horizon and spoke uneasily. "Turn 40 degrees east. We'll avoid them. It sounds like quite a few cannons firing." Sango turned to her crew, standing nearby with bated breath. "What do you think, Ced? About 6 different ships?" "I'd say so, based on what I've heard." "Must be big ones, too." His eyes nearly shut as he considered the truth of his words. Captain Valara returned to the deck and saw the flashing far off. "About 6 ships?" "Aye, Captain," they all assured her, and the children appeared from below deck with their eyes swelling with terror at the notion of another battle. "Turn the ship back to the same heading," she smiled. But her delight brought them no solace as they worried. She was rendered mad for further conflict. "We need to find out who won that battle." "Aye, Captain." But why?" Django asked as she passed the instructors to Dremo, who turned the wheel. "Those cannons we just heard are from Odin. Not all of them, but most of them." And as the last left her lips, everyone exhaled and gulped with relief. "They don't sound anything like the cannons on the Ravensword," Sango uttered with confusion as she listened more closely. "The Ravensword was built on Defeat Island. The cannons were repurposed from a pirate ship. There was almost nothing from Odin on that ship save the crew." Captain Vortol instructed his crew to arm themselves as they sailed on for another half hour before they finally arrived. There was fire on the water, and pirates treaded feebly and injured while crying for help. The Ravensword simply sailed on, the Odinites staring at them indifferently as they begged. Amidst the darkness it was impossible to see, but the lanterns burning at the bow and sterns of the ships were visible, and revealed to the crew that the victors were double their size. A voice rang out from one of the ships as they passed, and they cast ropes across to one another to come to a stop. "Ho, Odin's blessing be upon you." "What happened here?" Captain Vortol inquired, limping forward and peering at the man addressing them. "We came across these pirates, you see," he replied, laughing. He was old and bald and heavy and dressed in a supreme regalia. "We're looking for Captain Valara Victor, and we have urgent business with her." "Did you come from the fleet?" Captain Vortol issued his questions at him with undue suspicion. "Aye, we did, in search of the Admiral's daughter." for we have grim tidings concerning her father. What's wrong, Lucius? Is the admiral alive? Captain Valara advanced from the shadows and looked upon his face with fear growing in her eyes. The man looked down, and his expression turned both grief and cheer. He is not dead, but nor is he alive. He sleeps, but never wakes. We've tried everything that is known to us, and have failed to produce results. We sought you to deliver this news and to escort you to the fleet, so you may be addressed by Odin's Congress. You are indeed blessed. As Captain Valara and her crew were on this ship, Captain Vortal stepped away, and she approached the edge of the ship, anxious to learn more. Her countenance was cheerful as she uttered, Lucius, it is unfortunate our reunion should be under this weather, old friend. You say he sleeps but never wakes. I'm afraid so, Captain. Captain Vortal and his crew will come aboard one of your ships and stay for the remainder of the journey. This ship's quarters are far too small to accommodate everyone that came from his crew. Very well, the man said, and he went on. If I may introduce myself to your crews, my name is Lucius Meraxis, and I serve as a representative of the Congress's will. We've been sailing for quite some time, and the Admiral, bless his soul, has been in this state for more than 6 months. He pointed at 2 Odinites, and they grabbed a wide plank to cross onto their ship. Rocco was standing nearby, and he looked at Valara, who signaled him to gather their allies and send them across. After a few moments, the rest of his crew was on the deck and crossing one at a time. That's the end of Chapter 10, Volume 1, Chapter 10.